Everybody, hi, I'm Leonardo Bonanni. I'm the CEO of Sourcemap, and I'm here for our next session with John Foote, who is an attorney specializing in customs compliance at Kelley Drye. And we're going to spend the next hour getting as much familiarity as we can with the new landscape of customs compliance involving the supply chain, and specifically Section 307 of the forced labor enforcement actions that we've seen so frequently in the news these days. And so welcome, John.
Thanks, Leo. Good to be with you.
Thanks for joining us. I know people are going to be taking notes furiously during this session. So let's start at the beginning, because we have a lot of various industries represented today, and we have a lot of various countries and continents on the attending the conference. So what is, in a nutshell, what is Section 307?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the U.S. has had this law going back to 1930, and there are actually predecessor versions going back to the late 1800s. And it's a prohibition on importing anything into the United States that was made wholly or in part with forced labor. For much of the history of this law, there was an exception, a loophole in the provision of the bill that said that if goods were not made in the United States in enough quantities to satisfy domestic consumption, that the import ban did not apply. In other words, if you're importing something because there is a gap in the U.S. market, the ban did not apply. So it was an exception that sort of swallowed the rule. So fast forward to 2016, Congress removed that loophole from the bill, from the legislation, and what was left is a blanket ban on importing anything into the United States that is made wholly or in part with forced labor. So over the last 5 years, we've seen significant growth in utilization as Customs has begun to wield this tool against allegations of forced labor in different circumstances and contexts around the globe, but that's sort of the general history of the import ban.
There we go. Does the ban have any similarity to laws that are already on the books? I'm thinking the one in France, the vigilance law, and the UK modern slavery legislation.
Yeah, great question. So what's interesting about 307 is that it is a trade-specific law, and it really is about prohibiting the movement of physical goods across international borders, particularly the US border, when those goods have been made wholly or in part with forced labor. So there are several different legal regimes globally that have touched on sustainability issues, human rights issues, human rights and supply chain issues. The French duty of vigilance law obligates companies within the scope of that law to conduct a certain amount of due diligence with respect to their supply chain. Sort of the model that prevailed in a lot of jurisdictions before that was the Modern Slavery Act model. And the Modern Slavery Act is predicated on the notion of supply chain transparency, right? Obligating companies to make a disclosure about how they mitigate against the risk of forced labor or other adverse supply chain impacts, and that's also modeled after the California supply chain bill. This is a totally different genre of law, if I can use that phrase, because it's really focused on actually stopping the movement of goods that are bound in international transit. And really, it's the only law of its kind, although there have been sort of recent adoptions by other jurisdictions of similar laws sort of in principle. The US is the only jurisdiction that's actively enforcing its forced labor import ban really at this time.
Okay, so whereas the other legislation seems to be more about implementing business processes to map the supply chain, to obtain transparency, to do due diligence on the suppliers, this is the only one that's enforceable through an actual seizure of goods.
Yeah, that's right. So if your goods are named within it, so and I think that tees up a really an important point, which is sort of how does this get enforced? And the answer is Customs takes enforcement actions, and Customs has the ability to issue what they call a withhold release order, also referred to as a WRO. and a withhold release order identifies some category of merchandise that customs has reason to believe might be affected by forced labor. It might be tainted by forced labor. Customs will then detain shipments that contain the category of merchandise that's identified in NWRO at a border, and an importer is given the opportunity to either prove that the shipment coming in doesn't contain that category of merchandise, or it does contain the category that's specified in the order, but it wasn't made with forced labor, and actually able to put on proof about the condition of labor that was utilized in the supply chain to make the goods. So you're right. That is what is distinct about 307, is that it is a, well, what can you prove type of law, right? As opposed to conduct due diligence, take responsible, practices, tell the public about, tell your consumers about what you're doing. This is a proof-driven legal regime.
So if it's a burden of the company to prove that the shipment was made without forced labor anywhere along the supply chain, we'll get to that. But what does customs need to justify a WRO?
Yeah, so it's a relatively low threshold for the imposition of a WRO, and the entire process is treated as by U.S. Customs as a law enforcement process, which means that there's no sort of transparency to the process by which Customs will consider and decide and then eventually choose to impose a WRO. So sometimes, an NGO or a third-party group might petition for a WRO, and sometimes those groups have an interest in making their allegations or their petitions public. So we have gotten a glimpse at what sort of the type of allegation is that can give rise to a WRO, but the process for implementing it is entirely internal to Customs, and it's a relatively low threshold. It's evidence which reasonably indicates the presence of forced labor in the designated commodity. And the way Customs is looking at this is based on the interpretation of the statutory language, which says wholly or in part made with forced labor. They are considering whether a finished good contains, was itself made with forced labor, contains components that were made with forced labor, contains raw materials that may have been grown or harvested or produced with forced labor. So, it's the full kaleidoscope of the visibility of supply chain is sort of distilled into, Customs lens and its ability to focus at the border.
Okay, so it's a relatively opaque process, and the seizure can happen, and then it's a burden of the importer to demonstrate that the seizure was made in error. Is there any is this happening to a lot of people? Is it happening to a lot of industries? How widespread are these seizures today?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, as I mentioned, we're sort of entered the modern era of enforcement beginning in like 2016. 2 years ago, the total value of goods detained by U.S. Customs pursuant to Section 307 was about $200,000 US dollars. In 2019, that had jumped to $1 million. Last year, Customs detained $50 million of shipments pursuant to its enforcement of WROs. And this year, it sort of has broken sort of gone off the charts. Customs is currently detaining between like $60 and $90 million a month, which puts it on pace to detain about 600 million to a little over $1 billion over the course of the next year. So this has gone from sort of being completely not on the radar screen of most companies to a really considerable impact on the overall importation of the United States.
Let's talk about the impact across industries. So a lot of attention in the press goes to the region-wide ban on certain products from Xinjiang. Is this limited to that?
So we don't have a lot of visibility into the trade enforcement statistics. There have been statements made by customs officials with responsibility for overseeing this who have suggested that as many as 3/4 of the value of the overall detentions relate to the cotton order targeting cotton from Xinjiang in particular. And that sort of tracks with what I'm hearing from clients as well, is about 75% of the detention pace. So maybe $750 million a year right now is being detained on that pace pursuant to the cotton order alone.
Okay, so heavily focused, I'm guessing, in a way that will impact the apparel and housewares industry. What about the other 25%? Are we seeing any pattern there?
So Customs has basically taken two different types of enforcement actions. I just, they're WROs, but there have basically been two different categories of WROs that have been issued to date. There are WROs that target specific individual economic actors. So these are, company-specific WROs. The historic utilization of 307 WROs were issued primarily in instances of alleged prison labor by a finished manufacturer of goods. And there are a number of WROs dating back, decades, which are still theoretically in effect today, even if those, entities are now defunct. But some of the more noteworthy WROs within the last year or two have been targeting large, significant players, for example, in the palm industry, significant entities that are, real business concerns that aren't just going to disappear overnight because an order was issued against them and the company's just going to go away. These are real companies with, significant business portfolios. The other model is of a WRO is targeting a commodity from a jurisdiction like cotton from Xinjiang or cotton from Turkmenistan or gold from Malawi. There are a few different commodity country product or combinations that have been targeted by WROs.
Okay, so there's a global reach, even though the majority of the enforcements have been focused on Xinjiang. And if you're seeing the kind of exponential growth that we've seen in the value of detentions in the last year, where's the next year headed? What patterns can you tease out?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Customs has, Customs, because this is such a priority on the Hill, on Capitol Hill and in DC, there have been efforts to allocate funding specifically for forced labor enforcement. And so for the fiscal year that just ended 2 weeks ago, there was a specific allocation of funding that went to the forced labor enforcement. And in response to that allocation, Customs made public statements just a couple of weeks ago that they were standing up a second investigations branch. So now they've got 2 investigations branches. And this second investigations branch, it wasn't totally clear whether it's going to be fully geographically oriented elsewhere, but the customs official in charge of the forced labor division said to anticipate enforcement actions targeting goods from Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. So not just Asian jurisdictions. So we do anticipate that there will be additional action against either companies or commodities from each of those additional regions.
Okay, so a huge expansion in coverage and new funding for enforcement. Okay, so let's get to brass tacks. If a company experiences or thinks they might be subject to a WRO, what should they start doing?
Yeah, well, so I guess maybe it's worth sort of acknowledging the reality that different WROs, while it is a common sort of single, pretty blunt instrument that Customs is wielding here, different WROs impact businesses in radically different ways. And that's both when you're talking about the difference between a commodity-specific WRO versus a company-specific WRO. If you are an importing business that is importing into the United States and a company that's in your supply chain is named in a company-specific WRO, I think most importers have sort of an immediate assessment associated with how consequential is this supplier, how important is this supplier. If they are not a consequential or not a significant supplier, the easiest solution is to source from a different supplier. If they are a large player or a significant supplier in your supply chain, that's not always easy to do. And you have to sort of take additional steps at that point to figure out what type of evidence you can marshal with respect to goods from that company, or goods that originated with that company. If you're talking about navigating a commodity, even here there are potentially very significant differences in the type of response that a company might take. So, for example, with the order against cotton from Xinjiang, there has basically been, as far as I can tell, no appetite among anyone in the government or in the private sector to try and distinguish between types of cotton harvest within Xinjiang. Quite frankly, there's not a whole lot of appetite to distinguish between Xinjiang origin cotton and China origin cotton more broadly. And as a result, the natural response to that order is to try and avoid or to eliminate that category of cotton, that designation of cotton, from your supply chain entirely. It becomes a lot different if you talk about, a potential commodity order being imposed against a product for which there is only maybe 1 or 2 or 3 significant producers globally, where a commodity, WRO targeting a particular, type of agricultural product, from a jurisdiction that doesn't have available alternative sources of supply. In that instance, there are going to be a lot of companies that continue to be dependent upon that country and that source of supply, and there's going to have to begin to be the process of a distinction and a delineation between the types of flows, the types of commodities that are moving through your supply chain that are considered, low risk and high risk, that are considered clean and tainted, if you will.
So, I mean, in a sense, the assessing of the risk, it sounds like that's a no-brainer. Everybody has to start with that. Does customs care if there was negligence, intent? Does any of that matter to their ultimate judgment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer is customs does care about importers exercising sort of a basic standard of due care when it comes to their supply chain. Within the U.S. customs universe, there is this concept of reasonable care, and all importers are supposed to exercise reasonable care in the context of everything they do from a trade standpoint, from classifying their goods, figuring out how much stuff is valued, all the aspects associated with filing a customs declaration and entry with U.S. Customs to bring goods into the country. That extends to and includes efforts to ensure that there is no forced labor present within a supply chain. What is not true, though, it's not the case that simply by exercising reasonable care, you're going to guarantee that you're outside the cone of enforcement. At the end of the day, if you have a shipment that gets detained, it becomes a proof question. It becomes, what sort of proof can you marshal? If you've exercised reasonable care and you've got general sort of due diligence controls and whatnot in place designed to mitigate the risk of forced labor in your supply chain, great. You probably remove yourself from the cone of danger when it comes to issuance of a penalty. But if your objective is to preserve your ability to continue to keep this channel of trade open and bringing goods into the United States, we're talking about more than just reasonable care or basic sort of due diligence. It really comes down to a question of what can you prove about goods that are moving into the country. It's a proof-based regime. And it's novel. I mean, there's like nothing sort of like it. So there's definitely a learning curve for a lot of companies to begin thinking from that question. Even companies that really have their arms around, risk mitigation for forced labor within their supply chain generally, if you ask the question, suppose we have container number on the water on its way into the United States, how are you going to prove the absence of forced labor wholly or in part throughout the supply chain for the production of these individual items in this individual container? That's a tough question. And it is a question that presumes a level of knowledge about your supply chain that, if we're honest, a lot of companies don't have, right? A lot of companies don't have visibility. They don't have knowledge about the supply chain. They just don't know. And that's why I've enjoyed our conversations and our dialogue, because I think you're offering essentially a critical service. Like without knowing who the actors are in your supply chain, going back to origin, you're not even in a position to begin to answer a proof question that is specific to individual goods that might be coming to the US in a container.
Well, I'm right there with you. So let's go even deeper. So a risk assessment, obviously, anything you can do to anticipate and avoid working in regions or commodities and regions or with actors that have been identified as being high risk will save you a lot of heartache down the road. Assuming that, like most companies, you have the supply chain you have today, and any changes you're going to make to that supply chain are going to take months, maybe years. What are the, and I know this is something you specialize in, which is helping a company put in place that sort of documentation process that could prepare it for any kind of, it could be a questionnaire from Customs and Border Protection, could be a WRO. Can you talk a little bit more about the kinds of documentation, the kinds of systems that companies need to think about putting in place?
Yeah, sure thing. So I think the first question that any company that wants to sort of take the 307 threat seriously, the first question that you begin with is, what WRO would be problematic for me if it was issued tomorrow? What type of order, right? Is there a supplier within our supply chain who is critical, large volume, irreplaceable? Is there a commodity that we are dependent on from a jurisdiction that is critical, that is irreplaceable? Or is there just a commodity from a jurisdiction that we're highly dependent on? And there are, of course, many different ways, many different screening mechanisms that you can utilize to, triage your supply chain and come up with a sort of a short list of your worst case scenario. There was a time a couple of years ago when I was talking with a few clients who were particularly forward thinking. We asked this question, and the answer was, well, I think an order targeting cotton from China would be like the worst thing I could imagine. And at that time, when Customs was detaining $200,000 of shipments per year, it seemed like pretty far-fetched. I think a lot of people did not anticipate that Customs would actually pull the trigger on that, thinking that perhaps even just issuing that type of a WRO would sort of break the system. What we saw was that Customs did have the courage to take that step, sort of the political courage to take that step. The way they did it was basically by slowly on-ramping the actual detention process. So that WRO hit on day one. They did not immediately start detaining, the $10 billion of annual shipments that may be alleged to contain Xinjiang origin cotton overnight. It's been a slow on-ramp, but they're obviously picking up to a really considerable pace. So I think step one for a company is, what WRO would give us a problem, right? And then the second question is, well, what type of proof would Customs want to see with respect to individual shipments to navigate? And then so what type of proof? Customs thinks of the world in terms of, from a supply chain standpoint, they think of it in terms of sort of a pyramid. I like to use the analogy of like a family tree, right? Like, right, you've got, sort of direct suppliers, and your direct suppliers have their direct suppliers, and so on and so forth, going up to your great grandparents and beyond. And at some point you get to sort of like the creation of humanity. And mapping your supply chain is basically about like doing the basic genealogical research to identify who are the actors who are responsible for my existence, right? Or for the existence of the goods that are coming into the country. Customs thinks about the world in transactional terms, in terms of, if they are going to target a commodity deep in a supply chain, something that your great-great-grandparent may or may not have done, right? You have to know who your great-great-grandparent is before you can start making evaluations or assessments about whether they did or did not do the problematic act in question. So step one is, what WRO do I fear? Step two is, what do I know about my supply chain, about the actors within my supply chain? And then Customs is thinking about it on a transactional basis. And ultimately, if they are stopping a shipment based on the action of that one great-great-grandfather who procured Xinjiang origin cotton, what you would want to be able to do is to produce a document trail that would establish the provenance of the cotton fiber that was purchased by that great-great-grandfather and showing that it isn't Xinjiang origin. Now, there are other types of technologies that could potentially be leveraged here, but sort of at a base level, like if you ask what is customs looking for when they get a detention, the regulations, the customs laws say you got to get a certificate of origin from your supplier. And then you got to show us additional proof, whatever additional proof is needed to show that this problematic class of labor wasn't used. So the certification is it's very straightforward. It's a sign on the dotted line kind of certification from your supplier. But then it's the other proof that no forced labor was utilized, which is sort of this huge open-ended question. And I would say generally customs is looking for sort of transactional documentation that is then augmented by sort of all the rest of what sustainability operations in major companies are up to these days with respect to forced labor mitigation, and then potentially augmented by some sort of technological component to that. There's a lot of interest in that. So kind of a long-winded answer, very long-winded answer, but.
So no, but it's a long-winded problem. So understanding where the WROs are going to hit you the most, determining the criticality of the suppliers you need to focus on, and then pulling all the documents together. And I can only imagine, well, I know different industries, different commodities, completely different types of documentation to show that these standards are being upheld. Speaking of different commodities, a lot of the speakers at this conference, believe in various certifications and standards when they source some of the raw materials that are coming from around the world that we rely on every day. In your opinion, these standards, and I'm thinking, fair trade, rainforest, RSPO, these types of commodity-specific standards and certifications, which are often accompanied by audits, do they weigh in on this documentation?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I would say that for people who live and inhabit and breathe the air of the sustainability world, you got to flip through the Rolodex of all your certifications and think through, okay, which of these are related specifically to labor issues and specifically to forced labor, right? So there are lots of certifications that carry a lot of street cred, if I can say that, in a lot of environments that are just not relevant at all to the question of labor, forced labor. So for those that are, you pull those out of the Rolodex, and okay, so we've got a couple of different certifications. There are, of course, different models for certification, and one of the questions that I would say has not really decisively been answered by customs in any sort of public forum that I'm aware of is how customs treats systems for certifying that rely on the disaggregation of or disidentification of individual molecules or beans or pods of a particular product. So there are certification schemes that do it on a mass balance basis, right? Where a certain amount goes in, a certain amount comes out, and on a mass balance basis, the certifier says, we're keeping track of the columns and we're willing to certify a certain amount. For better or for worse, the 307 regime is really very much commodity specific. It's about those individual items that are coming in or the molecules that were baked into the loaves of bread that are coming in. It's very commodity specific, and it is not yet clear sort of how customs is going to handle that. But there is a clear affinity, I would say, from customs standpoint for defined chains of control, defined channels of supply, where possession is sort of documented and established, and the labor condition such that it is of a particular batch of goods is certified, is understood, is known, and is then traced throughout the supply chain. In other words, mass balancing might be perfectly acceptable within your certification regime. It is probably going to have a little bit of a different mileage when it comes to US customs. Because if your certification is predicated on a mass balance, there's still a question from customs standpoint of, should I allow this shipment of goods to come in? Does this constitute sufficient evidence that forced labor was not used on these goods, on these individual commodities that are coming in my, through my container? So, yeah, mixed mileage, but absolutely it has to be the starting place. And I would say that if I was putting on my, pulling out my crystal ball here, I would say that what I predict is I predict that in response to increasing enforcement by customs, there's going to be a push in the direction of direct identification through channels of supply. There's going to be a push in that direction. How much of a push or how far we'll get sort of remains to be seen, but I would say that, mass balance based structure and regime, sort of like generalized risk mitigation, which is totally effective and appropriate in the context of a due diligence regime, like a French duty of care law or a possible EU human rights due diligence. Mitigate your risk, document it, write up a report, show that you've reduced your risk. Like that's considered like enough. From a trade enforcement standpoint, it's more focused on what can you prove about the container that's coming in the water right now.
So moving from a sample-based or a mass balance-based approach to certifications to traceability, but keeping those certifications going, especially those that have standards and audits that directly deal with labor issues. Yeah,
that's right. And I would just say, there is no one right way to solve any of these problems. And the existing sort of certification regimes, right? Like they grew up in a world like pre-307, right? Pre-Section 307, where what really mattered was a brand's ability to communicate to a consumer, like we're trustworthy, right? We're keeping track, we're paying additional money, we're doing the best we can, but look, these things lose identity at moment one in the supply chain. In a world where there is an active enforcement regime that is focused on direct identification, I think the certification world is going to sort of catch up to that eventually. But there are some growing pains, and there are other ways too beyond sort of direct identification or sort of labor-intensive mechanisms. There are different ways to deploy, different types of technological tools, and everybody has like their favorite sort of idea or their favorite sort of project. But in terms of, well, we could do a forensic testing, or we could do a DNA testing, or we could, create some DNA and then we could apply it to the product and we can ship it through the supply chain and then we can measure. I mean, there's all kinds of really innovative and interesting strategies. What you need to be focused on is what's going to resonate and what's going to be, salient from a U.S. Customs enforcement standpoint, because they are the ultimate audience with respect to this type of enforcement, and they've got a certain view and a certain way of looking at the world and looking at supply chains, because that is part of the remit of the agency.
I'm getting some questions from the audience, but I think building on what we were just talking about. So, in the absence of certifications that are applicable to this particular CBP enforcement of the forced labor ban, are there audits that are audits enough? Are audits the recommended sort of best practice to deal with labor issues in the supply chain?
Yeah, so audits are. I think we all know that audits are sort of a mixed bag, right? I mean, they're a necessary evil or an evil good, or a necessary good that's got some flaws with it. It is essential. It is essential if a company wants to take responsibility for the conditions of labor in manufacturing operations throughout a supply chain, to have some sort of mechanism by which a third party comes in and evaluates what's going on. So they are necessary in that sense. I think there's a lot of people that level a lot of different types of critiques against them. They are very cumbersome. They're very difficult. They're very burdensome on suppliers. They are, debatable in terms of their effectiveness. But I mean, you got to do something. So they're an essential component, and certainly not one to be overlooked. If you're living in a world where there is a customs WRO targeting a commodity deep at the base of the supply chain, like no volume of audit activity on intermediaries within that supply chain, let's just say you've traced beyond tier 1. Let's say you've traced to tier 2. Let's say you've traced to tier 3. Let's say you're auditing tier 1, 2, and 3 in your supply chain, right, on a regular basis. Let's say you're putting in significant resources. That may be no evidence whatsoever of the presence or absence of what is deemed to be a problematic commodity deep in your supply chain. So they're an essential component. And if you're bringing an answer, so let me just say, by the same token, in enforcement, in responding to enforcement, I have heard anecdotally, and I haven't actually had any direct experience of this, but I've heard anecdotally that upon being presented with evidence that the commodity in question is not present in the supply chain, that sometimes customs has come back and asked, well, what about forced labor in the rest of the supply chain? Now, I have a little bit of a problem, and by little, I mean a big problem with that from a legal standpoint, because I don't think that's really justifiable under the law at all. But that highlights sort of another point, which is that for many companies, they feel like they are operating at a distinct disadvantage vis-a-vis customs, because there is sort of there's a stigma associated with being affiliated with even an accusation of forced labor, right? This is a highly sensitive topic, super brand sensitive for most companies. So coming back in answer to a question from customs with, I'm sorry, the law doesn't authorize you to be policing that, like that, there's usually like less appetite for that than I think there should be, because I think the basis for the law here is like, for how it is being wielded in certain instances is a little bit weak. But that said, if you are able to prove the absence of the problematic commodity, and then customs comes back to you and says, yeah, well, what about forced labor throughout the supply chain? What evidence do you have of that? Well, you better have a robust audit program in place, and you certainly want to leverage that. So the answer is, it's so diverse, and everyone's mileage is different. Everyone's experience is different. Everyone's supply chain is different. Everyone's economic weight vis-a-vis their supply chain is different, right? There are small companies importing into the United States that have no weight, or they have no ability to move the needle with regards to their suppliers. So they're really dependent on their suppliers being cooperative and just producing information that is needed. When you bring a response to customs, you want to bring everything, because ultimately it does end up becoming a bit of a reputation game, right? And they need to understand that you are serious, you're taking the problem seriously, you're taking the issue seriously, you're taking their enforcement seriously, and you want to bring them an answer that they deem sufficient, so that you become a less interesting target for enforcement.
Well, so it sounds like, and I mean, of course, it's a no-brainer. The value of the goods potentially seized is much lower than the value of the damage to the brand reputation from being associated with this. So it's not really a matter of preventing WROs. It's a matter of not being associated with forced labor in many cases.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there I mean, do you see consumer pressure as a driver when clients come to you asking for guidance in this matter?
Yeah, well, I think my best story about that is the press release or the press conference that was given by senior DHS officials at the time of the announcement of the cotton WRO against China. And the senior DHS official who gave this press conference basically said, we got the authority to do this, we can do it, we're doing it, and no one's ever challenged us on it. And we really hope that this is, a significant message to consumers, that consumers ought to be driving the conversation with brands, that we expect no forced labor in our goods. And I thought, now that's a really interesting framing from, a U.S. government official, because, in theory, you would think that an enforcement mechanism was not just about torquing companies that find themselves caught in an enforcement mechanism with the lever of danger to your brand, risk to your brand. But that is precisely how it was framed by the U.S. government officials who were announcing it. And that raises a whole host of questions about whether the U.S. government really takes it seriously, like what it's doing. I think the answer to that is that the customs officials who are running this day in and day out, they take it very seriously. But you cannot escape the fact that, at least in some of the early issuance of these, there are political determinations that are being made. And this is very much a part of the broader, more complex political reality that is the landscape of, for example, the US-China trade relationship. It's complex, and people are not afraid to weaponize the reputational association of being affiliated with an allegation of forced labor. People are not afraid to weaponize that. In my view, it's completely the wrong way to think about the law. The law should be the law. It should function in a neutral and an impartial way, and it should be equitable and fair, and there should be a clear pathway to sort of what behavior is expected in order to avoid bad enforcement outcomes. And I think we are moving in that direction, but I don't think we are quite there yet.
In many ways, this becomes a question of brand protection. So, and these are, I promise these are not my questions, but from several people in the audience, basically, where does technology fit in to help solve these problems? When is it necessary? There's a lot of approaches. There's a lot of types of service providers you can adopt, but at which point do you really need technology to mitigate this risk?
Yeah. So the truth is technology can be utilized in a lot of different ways, right? And I would say sort of from my view, the most fundamental is using it to enhance your capacity to track the identity of the family tree, we're harkening back to my previous metaphor. That I think is really critical. There are a surprising number of businesses that are still trying to keep tabs on their supply chain I heard Luke mention from going back many years, right? Trading spreadsheets back and forth across the globe, keeping tabs on who are we doing business with, and that's just really still very common. And as I said before, the underlying assumption of customs enforcement of 307 is that companies have a level of knowledge or can gain a level of knowledge about their supply chain, about the identity of the actors in their supply chain, and what's going on, what those actors are up to from a labor standpoint. That assumption is just not really borne out in reality a lot of times. So my recommendation to everyone is utilize some technology, find yourself your favorite platform that will help facilitate that. Big fan of that. There's other ways to use technology, right? And there are companies that again, are purporting to utilize sort of forensic testing methodology to establish definitively the country of origin of a given commodity or a given product. I think that those can be useful. They have to be wielded wisely and judiciously. I had a public dialogue with a customs official recently, or a former customs official who described the government's potential utilization of that technology as a, quote, nirvana state. And you can imagine from a customs standpoint why that might be, right? Customs, if companies don't know their supply chains, many companies don't know the origin of the commodities deep in their supply chains. If companies don't know, customs knows even less than that, right? Customs does not have some magic way of knowing which cotton containing goods coming into the United States contain Xinjiang origin cotton, if that's the prohibited jurisdiction in question. Having a technology that would allow an individual garment to be sampled, sent out for testing, and come back and say, yep, thumbs up, that's Xinjiang origin, and we're statistically confident, that is a potentially powerful tool. It's also a really potentially risky tool for the trade. And if you're a member of the trade, if you're in industry and you're in business and you're interested in utilizing technology like that, there is potential value there, but there's also a lot of risks associated with it. And I think you just need to be super judicious about what you're testing, what types of responses you might get. It's more complex than meets the eye, utilizing that type of testing, and there are definitely considerable risks that need to be managed. But I'm a big fan of technology, and I think that there are also sort of under-approached frontiers when it comes to reducing the forced labor risk itself, utilizing technology, whether it's sort of in managing or overseeing sort of payment mechanisms or abilities to sort of guarantee and ensure sort of who are the actual laborers doing work in fields. There's lots of things that could be utilized to drive insight and add value in a way that would really sing. Those are just a few of them.
That's great. John, I couldn't have asked for more, and I think the audience agrees. Is there any last words you want to pitch your services to our fine audience?
No, look, the question really just begins with what am I facing? What am I fearful of? And what would I do if this hit tomorrow when we had a shipment detained? What would we produce? What would we explain? How would that resonate with customs? I think that's just a question that every company needs to be asking themselves at this point. And yeah, and I'm happy to send, if anyone's interested in those trade stats, feel free to shoot me a note, and I'm happy to circulate sort of the numbers and the the background on it.
Sounds great. John Foote, Kelley Drye, thanks for all of your expertise and all your wise words.
Thanks, Leah.
Everyone.
Thanks for having me.